A man bought a dying farm at auction, and the auctioneer threw in a chained orc woman as if she were a plow horse. What he did in the next hour at the county office was the thing nobody in that town ever forgave him for. The auction had been announced in the paper, the way most auctions were announced in that part of the frontier, in small print between the grain prices and the church notices. Thomas Reilly hadn't gone looking for anything special. He'd gone because his own patch of ground had gone thin and tired after 8 years of the same crop, and because the bank had started sending letters with a different tone to them, and because a man needed more land if he meant to keep eating come winter. He was 34 years old, and he had the kind of face that made people think he was older, weathered by sun and wind and something underneath that had nothing to do with weather at all. His wife had died 3 winters back, a fever that came fast and took her faster. And after that, Thomas had folded himself into work the way some men fold themselves into drink. He didn't drink. He worked. There was a difference, though. Most days he couldn't have told you what it was. He lived alone on his little parcel outside a town called Millbrook Hollow, a town that liked to think of itself as decent and God-fearing and mostly was, in the way that towns are decent right up until decency costs them something. He had no children. He had a dog that had died the year before, and that he hadn't replaced. He had a rhythm to his days that he'd built like a fence, plank by plank, to keep the empty parts of himself from spilling out where anyone could see. That was the life he brought with him to the Kessler place on the morning of the auction, a life so quiet it had almost stopped making noise at all. The Kessler place had been a good farm once, 40 acres with a real well, and a barn that didn't lean, but old man Kessler had died without heirs worth the name, and the county had seized it for taxes, and now it was being sold off piece by piece to whoever had cash and nerve. Thomas had both, or enough of each, to matter. He stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat pulled low and his hands in his coat pockets, watching the auctioneer work through the lots, the plow, the seed store, the 3 milk cows, the chickens. Then the auctioneer called out the last lot, and the crowd shifted the way a crowd shifts when it senses something it isn't sure it should enjoy. They brought her out from behind the barn on a length of chain. An orc woman, tall, even with her shoulders bent forward, her wrists raw where iron had worn the skin. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at a spot on the ground a few feet in front of her boots, and she kept looking at it, the way a person looks at something when looking anywhere else costs too much. Thomas felt something in his chest go tight and cold at the same time, a feeling he hadn't had since the fever took Sarah, and he didn't understand it yet. Not fully, but his boots had already carried him 2 steps closer before his mind caught up with his body. The auctioneer called her a laborer, said she'd come with Kessler's debts from some contract nobody could quite explain, said she was strong, said she was broken to work, said all of it in the flat voice a man uses when he is selling a thing and not a person, because that was the only way the law let him think about her at all. Thomas had heard of orcs, the way most frontier folk had heard of them, through stories that made them into monsters or into slaves, nothing in between, and he had never had reason to test either story against the truth. But standing there in the cold morning light, watching a grown woman refuse to lift her eyes off the dirt, he found he didn't care what story he'd been told. He cared about the chain. The bidding on her started low and moved fast, men in the crowd calling out numbers with the same tone they'd use for a plow horse. And something about that tone was what finally broke through the fence Thomas had built around himself 3 years back. He raised his hand and named a number that emptied out his savings, and half of what the bank had agreed to lend him for seed, and the auctioneer's eyebrows went up and the crowd went quiet. In that particular way, crowds go quiet when they realize the joke has stopped being funny. Nobody bid against him. Nobody wanted to spend that kind of money on a farmhand they could get for less trouble somewhere else, and so the hammer came down, and just like that, on a cold morning in early spring, Thomas Reilly owned a farm, 3 cows, 2 dozen chickens, and, according to the paper the auctioneer pressed into his hand, 1 adult female orc, labor stock, no name recorded. He looked at that paper a long time before he folded it into his coat pocket. The walk back to the wagon was the longest quarter-mile of his life. She walked behind him at the length the chain allowed, and he was aware of every step of it, aware of the way the townsfolk watched them go, aware of the low murmur that followed like flies over a carcass. He did not look back at her until they reached the wagon, and when he did, he found her watching him with an expression so carefully empty, it took his breath away, because he recognized it. It was the same expression he wore most mornings when he looked in the shard of mirror by his wash basin. He reached for the chain where it looped to a post on the wagon bed, and she flinched just slightly, just enough that he caught it, and he stopped his hand halfway there. He said he was only going to unhook it, so she could sit proper for the ride. She said nothing. She watched his hands the way a person watches the hands of someone they have learned, through hard lessons, to watch closely. He unhooked the chain from the post, but left the manacles on her wrists, because he did not yet have the tools to cut them and did not want to make a show of trying in front of the crowd still lingering by the auction block. He helped her up onto the wagon bed, an old instinct of courtesy that surprised him even as he did it, and she took his offered hand for exactly as long as balance required and not a second longer. They rode back to his farm in silence, the wagon wheels complaining over the ruts, and Thomas spent the whole ride trying to work out what exactly he had just done and why, and coming up with an answer that embarrassed him with its simplicity. He had done it because nobody else in that crowd had looked at her and seen a person, and something in him, some old buried piece of himself that predated Sarah's death and the fever and all the folding inward, had refused to let that stand. It wasn't logical. He told himself that twice. On the ride home, it wasn't logical, and the bank wasn't going to care about his feelings when the note came due, and he had just spent seed money on a woman he didn't know how to talk to, and didn't know how to feed, and didn't know, if he was honest, whether she would try to kill him in his sleep out of a decade of stored-up hatred that he could not blame her for having. But logic had never been what moved him that morning. The chain had moved him. The dirt she stared at instead of the crowd had moved him. And now here they were. When they reached his farm, the sun was low enough to throw long shadows off the barn, and he pulled the wagon up near the house and sat there a moment before climbing down, because he realized he had absolutely no idea what came next. He got down first and came around to help her, and this time she did not take his hand. She climbed down on her own, landing solid on both feet, and stood there looking at the house and the barn and the fields beyond with an expression that gave away nothing. He asked her name. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer, and then she said it, short and flat, like a word she hadn't used in a long time and wasn't sure still fit her mouth. Griga. He said it back to her, careful with the sounds, and something flickered behind her eyes that might have been surprise, though it was gone before he could be sure. He told her his name, too, though she hadn't asked. And then he stood there in his own dooryard feeling like a fool for not knowing what a person was supposed to do next when they just bought a woman at auction and didn't want to have bought her at all. What he did was walk her to the barn first, not the house, because he understood, without being told, that the barn would feel safer to her, less like a trap, and he showed her where the tools were and where the stalls were, and did not touch the manacles again, though he told her, plain and simple, that come morning he'd have them off her with a file if it took him all day. She did not thank him. She watched him with that same careful blankness, and he understood that thanks was not a currency she trusted yet, maybe not a currency she trusted at all, and he let it go. That first night he gave her the small room off the kitchen that had been meant for a hired hand, back when the farm had been prosperous enough to need one, and he brought her a plate of food, bread and salt pork and boiled potatoes, plain food, the only food he had. And he set it on the little table without ceremony, left her alone to eat it or not eat it, as she chose. He heard her later, moving quietly in that room, and he lay awake in his own bed, down the hall, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing under his roof, and he found that the sound, instead of unsettling him further, loosened something in his chest that had been wound tight for 3 years. He did not examine that feeling too closely. He was not ready. The next morning he filed the manacles off her wrists at the kitchen table, working slow and careful with an old rasp, and she sat still and let him, watching his hands the whole time, and when the iron finally fell away and hit the floorboards with a sound like a small bell, neither of them said anything for a long moment. She rubbed at the raw skin on her wrists, and he saw her jaw work, like she was chewing on something that wasn't food, and he understood, without her having to say it, that this was the first time in longer than she probably wanted to remember that she had stood in a room without iron on her. He told her the room off the kitchen was hers, for as long as she wanted it. He told her the work on the farm was work he'd share with her, not work he'd order her to, and that if she wanted to leave once she'd gotten her feet under her, the road ran both directions, and he wouldn't stop her. Tatter. She looked at him a long time after he said that, like she was waiting for the second half of the sentence, the part where the catch came in, the part every kindness she'd ever been offered had turned out to have hidden inside it. The catch never came, because he didn't have one to offer, and after a while she looked away first, out the window at the gray fields, and said only that she would work. That was the whole of it. For a good while she would work. He would work. They moved around each other in the mornings with the careful distance of two dogs who hadn't decided yet whether they were going to fight or not, and slowly, over days that turned into weeks, the distance shortened without either of them announcing it. It was 3 days after the auction that Thomas rode into town to handle the paperwork the law required, and it was that visit that turned out to matter more than anything else he did that whole first season. The county office in Millbrook Hollow was a squat brick building with a clerk named Otis Pruitt behind the counter, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a talent for making every visitor feel like they were interrupting something important. Thomas came in with the auction paper in his coat pocket and stood at the counter while Otis finished whatever he was writing, in no hurry at all. When Otis finally looked up, Thomas told him he needed to register a new resident on his property. For the county rolls, same as anybody would for a hired hand or a boarder, Otis asked the name. Thomas said, Reilly. Otis's pen stopped moving. He asked, careful, like he thought he'd misheard, whether Thomas meant to register the orc from the Kessler sale. Thomas said that was exactly who he meant. Otis set his pen down entirely and folded his ink-stained hands on the counter and explained, in the tone of a man explaining something to a child, that the sale paper listed her as Livestock property, not a person, and that the county rolls didn't have a column for that kind of registration because livestock didn't get registered as residents. They got recorded as assets, and if Thomas wanted her recorded, he'd want the assessor's office, not the resident rolls. Thomas said he understood what the sale paper said. He said the sale paper was wrong. Otis asked him to repeat that. Thomas repeated it. There was a silence in that little brick office that Thomas would remember for a long time afterward, a silence with weight to it, because he understood even as he stood there that what he was doing was not a small thing, not a quiet private choice he could make and walk away from unnoticed. It was a public act recorded in ink that would sit in that ledger for anyone in the county to look up and read, and it would tell every one of his neighbors exactly what he thought about the woman he'd brought home from that auction. He thought of Sarah for a moment standing there the way he sometimes did at odd hours, not because the situations had anything to do with each other, but because grief has a way of surfacing at exactly the moments a man is making a decision that matters. He thought about the fence he'd built around his life, plank by plank, and about how for 3 years that fence had kept him safe and empty in equal measure, and about how 3 days ago a woman staring at the dirt in an auction yard had put a crack in it that he did not particularly want to repair. He told Otis to write it the way he'd said it. Reilly. Resident, family. Otis stared at him a long moment, and then, because there was no law explicitly forbidding it, only custom, only the unspoken weight of what everybody assumed and nobody had ever bothered to write down as a rule, he picked his pen back up and wrote it, muttering the whole time that Thomas was going to catch hell for this, that the Hollow wasn't going to sit quiet on it. Thomas said, expected as much, and thanked him, and walked out into the cold with the paper receipt in his coat pocket and felt lighter than he had in 3 years, and heavier than he had in 3 years, both at once, in a way that didn't make sense until he'd had time alone on the ride home to sit with it. Word got around fast, the way it does in small towns, faster than seed catalogs and slower than nothing at all. Within a week, half of Millbrook Hollow knew that Thomas Reilly had registered an orc as family at the county office, and the reaction was about what he braced himself for, though bracing for a thing and living through it turned out to be different animals entirely. The reverend at the little clapboard church made a point, the following Sunday, of preaching on the natural order of things, on the proper places God had assigned to every creature, without once saying Thomas's name, though every head in the pews turned toward the back row where Thomas normally sat and did not sit that particular Sunday. The general storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Cobb, who'd known Thomas's father, started charging him different prices than he charged other farmers, and didn't bother hiding it, and told Thomas plainly, when Thomas asked, that a man who kept company with an orc in his house could take his business to the next town over if the prices here didn't suit him. Thomas took his business to the next town over. It cost him half a day extra travel every time he needed supplies, and it cost him some friendships he thought were sturdier than they turned out to be. Men he'd known since boyhood who now crossed the street rather than nod to him. And it cost him, most of all, a kind of ease in his own town that he hadn't realized he'd valued until it was gone. But at home, something else was growing, in the space that ease had left behind. Grigga did not know, at first, what Thomas had done at the county office. He told her plainly one evening, over a supper of stew and bread, because he did not believe in letting a person's fate get decided behind their back, even a small fate like a line in a ledger. He told her the sale paper had called her labor stock, and that he'd gone into town and had that changed, that she was recorded now as a resident of his household, family, in his name, and that it meant, as far as the law in this county understood such things, that nobody could come and claim her, the way Kessler's creditors had once claimed her. Because she wasn't property anymore. She was a person with a name on a document. The same as he was. She set her spoon down. She asked him why he'd done it. He thought about the question longer than a simple question probably deserved, turning his own spoon over in his stew without eating, and then he said that he didn't rightly know how to explain it, except that no person ought to go through their whole life without ever once having their name written down somewhere that mattered, and that he had the chance to fix that for her, small as it was, and that a man who saw a chance like that and didn't take it wasn't much of a man at all. She looked at him for a long time after that, in the low lamplight of the kitchen, and he watched something move behind her eyes, that he didn't have a name for yet, something that wasn't quite trust, but was maybe the seed a person plants before trust can grow at all. She told him, quiet, that in the place she'd come from before Kessler, before the auctions, orcs were named only in the ledgers of those who owned them, listed the way you'd list a wagon or a plow, and that the only time her name had ever been written down before was on a bill of sale. Thomas didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have sounded small next to what she'd just told him. He just sat with her in the quiet kitchen, lamp burning low, and let the silence hold the weight of it, instead of trying to fill the silence with words that couldn't carry that kind of weight anyway. That was the night. Something between them shifted quiet and unremarked, the way the seasons shift, not on a single day, but somewhere in the accumulation of many ordinary days stacked one on top of the other. The weeks that followed brought planting season, and planting season brought work that neither of them could do alone. And it was in that shared labor, more than in any conversation, that the real trust between them got built, plank by plank, the same slow way Thomas had once built the fence around his grief. Grigga turned out to have a farmer's instinct in her hands that surprised him, not because he doubted her strength, but because he hadn't expected the care, the way she'd test the soil between her fingers before deciding where to set a row, the way she talked low and easy to the cows when she milked them. A language he didn't understand but recognized all the same as the language of someone who respected the animals in her charge rather than merely using them. He taught her the particular rhythms of his own farm, the low spot in the north field that flooded, if you didn't plant it high, the trick to the stubborn barn door that needed lifting slightly on its hinge before it would swing, the way the well rope had to be coiled a certain way, or it would tangle and cost you 10 minutes you didn't have come morning. She taught him things too, though she was slower to offer them. Things about reading weather in the particular way the grass bent, about a method of binding wounds with crushed herbs that worked faster than anything the frontier doctor had ever given him, knowledge she'd carried from a life before chains that she'd assumed, he came to understand, nobody would ever want from her again. There was a day, midway through planting, when a length of fence gave way under the weight of a fallen tree limb, and the two of them worked side by side for the better part of an afternoon, hauling the limb clear and resetting the posts. And somewhere in the middle of that work, soaked in sweat and dirt, Thomas caught himself laughing, actually laughing. At something so small he couldn't have said afterward what it was, maybe just the mud on his boots or the way the post kept refusing to sit straight, and he realized with a start that he hadn't laughed like that, easy and unplanned, since before Sarah died. Reilly looked at him when he laughed, something almost like surprise crossing her face, and then, slow, like she was testing whether the expression still fit her. She almost smiled. It wasn't much. It was the ghost of a smile there and gone in a second, but Thomas carried that ghost of a smile with him the rest of the day, like a man carries a coin he's found in the road, turning it over in his mind, wondering at his own luck. It was around this time that a girl started showing up at the fence line most afternoons, a neighbor child named Mercy Alden, 7 years old, with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's curious eyes. And she had exactly none of the town's careful manners about the whole situation. She'd climb up on the fence rail and watch Grigga work and ask her questions with the kind of directness only children manage, asking her once, plain as anything, whether it hurt to have tusks, and whether she missed her family, and whether the other kids at school were right, that orcs ate raw meat like wolves. Questions that would have mortified any of the adults in town to hear spoken aloud, but that Grigga, to Thomas's quiet astonishment, answered every one, of patient and unbothered, like the bluntness of a child was a relief after the careful cruelty of grown folks. Mercy's father didn't much like his daughter spending afternoons at the Reilly fence line and said so to Thomas once in town, in front of the feed store, loud enough for others to hear, and Thomas told him plainly that Mercy was welcome at his farm anytime she liked, and that if her father had a problem with who she talked to there, that was a conversation he could have with his daughter, not with Thomas. The man didn't have an answer for that, and Mercy kept coming. And somewhere in her visits, she stopped asking Grigga questions about being an orc and started asking her questions about everything else, about the garden, about the cows, about a doll she was fixing to sew, and that shift, small as it was, told Thomas something had changed in at least one corner of that town's opinion, even if the rest of it hadn't budged an inch. One evening in early summer, sitting out on the porch steps after the work was done, Grigga told him about her life before Kessler, the first time she'd spoken more than a sentence or two about it, and Thomas understood the way she settled into the telling, low and steady, that she'd been holding this in a long time and had finally decided the ground was solid enough under her to set it down. She told him she'd had a mate once, back before the wars pushed her people south into territory that didn't want them, and that he'd died in a skirmish that hadn't even had a name, one of 100 small, brutal fights that never made it into any history, and that after that she drifted, alone, through a world that had decided orcs without clan or protection were fair game for whoever wanted to claim them. He told them about the years of contracts and debts and sales, one after another, each one stripping a little more of her name away until she'd nearly forgotten the sound of it herself, and she told him, quiet, that she had stopped expecting kindness somewhere in there, had stopped expecting anything at all except the next order, the next chain, but the next owner. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting, because he understood that this wasn't a story that wanted commentary, it was a story that wanted a witness, and when she finished, he sat with her in the dark a while before he spoke. He told her then about Sarah, the first time he'd spoken her name aloud to another living soul since the funeral, and he told her about the fever, and about the 3 years after where he'd built his life, smaller and smaller, until there was almost nothing left of it but work. And he told her that the day he'd seen her standing in that auction yard staring at the dirt, something in him that had been asleep a long time had woken up without asking his permission. First, they didn't touch. That night, they didn't need to. The words sitting between them in the dark did more work than touch could have done, and when they finally went inside to their separate rooms, something had settled between them that hadn't been there before, something neither of them had a word for yet, but that both of them recognized as real. The threat, when it came from a direction Thomas hadn't fully prepared for, though he should have. Kessler's estate, it turned out, had an outstanding claim against it that predated the tax seizure, a debt owed to a man named Silas Grove, a trader who dealt in labor contracts up and down the frontier, and who arrived at the Reilly farm on a hot afternoon in late summer with 2 hired men and a folded piece of paper. He seemed very pleased with himself about Grove was a lean man with a salesman's smile that never reached his eyes, and he explained, standing in Thomas's own dooryard like he owned the ground under his boots, that the orc labeled in Kessler's original contract had been pledged against a debt that the county auction hadn't properly cleared. A technicality, he called it, a paperwork matter. Nothing personal, but the upshot of it was that the woman standing behind Thomas on that porch belonged, by contract law older than the tax seizure, to him. Thomas felt Griga go very still behind him, and he understood without turning around that this was the exact fear she had carried with her since the day the manacles came off. The fear that kindness was only ever a pause between chains, that no kindness lasted, that the world always found its way back to claiming what it had decided she was. He told Grove that the woman on his porch was his family, registered as such at the county office, and that whatever contract Grove thought he was holding didn't mean anything anymore, because the person it claimed to describe wasn't property under county law, hadn't been for months. And Grove could take his paper back to whatever judge had drawn it up and find out for himself how far it would carry him. Grove's smile thinned but didn't disappear. He said paper was paper, and old contracts had a way of outlasting new registrations, and that Thomas might find himself in a courtroom before the season was out, and that courtrooms in this territory had a way of remembering what orcs were for. Whatever a county clerk had scribbled in a fit of soft-heartedness, Thomas told him, plain and level, that he'd see him in that courtroom then, and that he'd bring every neighbor who'd watched Griga work this land for the better part of a year, and every piece of paper the county had on file, and that Grove was welcome to try his luck against all of it. Grove left without pushing further that day, but he left the folded paper stuck under the porch rail like a promise, and Thomas understood that the fight wasn't over, only postponed. The days that followed were tight with a kind of tension Thomas hadn't felt since the war years of his own youth, a waiting tension, the kind that made ordinary chores feel like they were happening underwater. Griga barely spoke. Thomas caught her once, standing at the edge of the north field at dusk, looking toward the road like she expected Grove's men to come up at any moment with chains in their hands. He came and stood beside her, not touching her, just standing close enough that she'd know he was there, and he told her that whatever paper Grove had, it wasn't going to matter, because he wasn't going to let it matter, because she was not going back into a chain as long as he had breath in him to stand in the way of it. She looked at him a long moment in the fading light, and she asked him, quiet, why he'd risk all of it, the farm, his name in the town, whatever peace he had left. For her, he said it wasn't a risk. He said a man who let something like that happen to someone he'd come to care for when he had the power to stand against it wasn't a man worth being, and that he'd rather lose the farm and his name in the town both than lose the chance to prove that some kindnesses were worth keeping even when they cost you something. She didn't answer that with words. She reached over slow and took his hand, the first time she'd done so since the wagon ride home from the auction all those months before. And they stood there at the edge of the field, hands joined, watching the light go out of the sky, and Thomas felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could easily measure. A feeling that had a lot in common with hope. The court date came in early autumn, held in the same county building where Thomas had registered her name months before, and the room was fuller than Thomas expected, fuller with faces he half recognized, farmers he'd worked beside as a young man, a few of them men who'd crossed the street from him all summer rather than nod hello. Grove brought his paper and a lawyer with a city accent who spoke a long while about precedent and property law, using words that filled the room like smoke and meant, boiled down, that the county had exceeded its authority in registering an orc as a resident rather than an asset, and that the original contract superseded any clerical decision made afterward. Thomas had no lawyer. He had Otis Pruitt, the clerk, standing as a witness, older and quieter than Thomas remembered him, who told the judge plainly that the registration had followed every rule on the books at the time it was made, because the books had never said an orc couldn't be registered as family, only that nobody had ever asked before, and that the law couldn't now invent a rule after the fact simply because a man from out of county didn't like the answer he'd gotten. Then an old woman stood up from the gallery. someone Thomas didn't know by name until she introduced herself as Nan Okoye, a free woman of the Kessler estate's own household staff, years back, who told the judge she remembered Griga from the years before the debts piled up, remembered her tending Kessler's sick wife with more gentleness than any hired nurse the family had paid for, and that whatever contract Grove was waving around had been drawn up by men who traded in flesh because it was easier than earning an honest wage, and that the county owed this woman more than a fair hearing. Two owed her the truth, finally, being spoken out loud in a room that mattered. The judge, an older man with tired eyes who'd clearly seen more of this territory's uglier business than he cared to have seen, sat with all of it a long while before he spoke, and when he finally did, he said that a debt contract built on a person could not outlast the moment that person was recognized, properly and lawfully, as exactly that a person, that the county's registration stood, and that Silas Grove's claim was void, and that he'd best take his paper and his lawyer and his hired men back across the county line before Thomas Reilly decided to file a complaint of his own regarding harassment. Grove left the courtroom with his smile gone entirely, and Thomas didn't watch him go because he was watching Griga instead. Watching the way her shoulders, which had been braced tight since Grove first appeared in the dooryard weeks before, finally came down slow, like a held breath finally let go. Outside the courthouse, in the cold autumn light, several of the farmers who'd crossed the street from Thomas all summer came up to him, one by one, awkward, and said their piece, some of it clumsy, some of it barely an apology at all, but all of it amounting to the same quiet admission that they'd been wrong to treat a man poorly for doing a decent thing. And Thomas took each of those clumsy apologies without making a show of it, because he understood that trust rebuilt after a breach doesn't come back all at once. It comes back the same slow way it was built the first time, plank by plank. Mercy Alden's father was among them, and he didn't say much, just nodded at Thomas, and then, surprising everyone, nodded at Griga too, a small thing, but Thomas saw Griga register it, saw something in her face ease a little further at the sight of it. They rode home that evening in the wagon, same as they had the day of the auction, almost a year before, but nothing about the ride was the same. She sat beside him this time, not behind him, no chain between them, no distance either, and the fields on either side of the road were gold with the last of the harvest light, and neither of them said much, because there wasn't much that needed saying anymore. Winter came gentler that year than the one before it, or maybe it only felt that way because the house had two sets of hands to split the wood and two sets of shoulders to carry the worry, and Thomas found himself, some evenings, sitting across the table from Griga, with nothing more urgent between them than a shared meal and a comfortable quiet. And he understood that this, more than anything he built in 3 lonely years before her, was what a home was supposed to feel like. It was Griga, in fact, who brought it up first, on a night in deep winter with snow banked high against the windows, saying, plain and without much ceremony, that she'd been thinking about the paper he'd filed at the county office all those months back, the one that named her family, and that she wondered whether he'd meant it only as a shield against men like Grove, or whether he'd meant it as something more lasting than that. Thomas told her he'd meant every word of it the day he wrote it, and that he meant it more now than he had then, because now he knew her, not just the shape of her suffering, but the whole of her patience with the cows, and her bluntness with Mercy's questions, and her steady hands in the planting season, and the low sound of her voice telling him, that night on the porch, about a mate lost to a nameless skirmish, and that if she was willing, he'd like to make the paper true in every sense a paper could be true, not just family in the eyes of the county, but family in the eyes of anyone who cared to look. She didn't answer right away. She looked at him a long while across the table, and then she reached over and took his hand the way she had at the edge of the north field, and she said, simple as anything, that she'd like that too. They were married in the spring, a small ceremony out by the north field, where the fence had once broken under a fallen limb, with Otis Pruitt standing witness alongside Nan Okoye and a handful of neighbors who'd come around slow but had come around all the same, and Mercy Alden, 9 years old by then. They stood at the front, holding a fistful of wildflowers. She'd picked herself and declared, in the blunt way she'd always had, that Griga made the best bread in the county, and any man who married her for her bread alone would still be getting a fair bargain. It was, Thomas thought, about as fine a blessing as a wedding could ask for. The years that followed weren't easy, because frontier life rarely is, but they were full in a way Thomas hadn't let himself imagine full could feel. The farm prospered slow and steady, the way farms do when there are two people instead of one to carry the weight of the seasons. Griga's knowledge of the land, gathered from a life he'd once known nothing about, made the harvests richer than they'd been in Kessler's day or in Thomas's own lonely years before her. The town, or most of it, came around, the way towns do when they finally get tired of holding a grudge that costs them nothing to let go of and something to keep holding. There was a day, a few years on, when Thomas stood at the county office once more, this time to register a birth, a daughter, half orc and half human, with her mother's steady eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and Otis Pruitt, gray now and slower with his pen than he'd once been, wrote the name down without a single word of hesitation. Because by then the ledger had long since stopped being strange to him, and the town had long since stopped whispering about the family out on the old Kessler place and had started instead simply calling it the Reilly farm, same as any other. Thomas thought, walking out of that office with the new paper folded in his coat pocket, about the first paper he'd folded there years before, the one that had cost him friends and trade and a season of peace in his own hometown, and he understood, standing in the same doorway with an entirely different kind of paper in his hand, that every hard thing he'd given up that first year had bought him something the town could never have sold him back, a family built not out of convenience or custom, but out of a choice made freely, over and over on ordinary days that asked nothing more of him than to keep choosing it. He thought of the auction yard sometimes still, the memory, not gone but softened by everything that had come after it, the woman staring at the dirt, because looking anywhere else cost too much, and he understood now that the two of them had spent all those years since teaching each other how to look up again. It was never really about the paper at all. In the end, the paper was only ever the first small proof that a person's worth doesn't depend on who's willing to admit it out loud. What mattered was everything that came after, the slow seasons of shared work and shared silence, the trust built the same patient way a fence gets built, plank by plank, until it can hold up against any weather that comes. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and following the channel for more.